The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Windsor Castle as Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood at the window of her private study. Her fingers traced the condensation on the glass, while she watched groundskeepers tend to the rose gardens below. The familiar routine of palace life continued around her, but something felt different today. The weight of recent months pressed against her chest like a stone she couldn't dislodge. William had left early for a series of meetings with palace officials, his footsteps echoing down the marble corridors before dawn broke. She had pretended to sleep, listening to the careful way he moved through their bedroom, gathering his things without disturbing her. It was a dance they had perfected over the years, this careful consideration for each other's space and rest. But lately, the dance felt more like distance. The princess turned from the window and walked to her desk, where a stack of correspondence waited for her attention. Letters from charities, invitations to galas, requests for patronage. Each envelope represented someone hoping for her involvement, her presence, her voice. She picked up the first letter from a children's hospital in Manchester and felt the familiar tug of purpose. These were the moments that reminded her why she had chosen this life, why she had said yes to a future filled with public scrutiny and private sacrifice. Her phone buzzed against the mahogany desktop, a text from her sister Pippa asking about weekend plans. Catherine stared at the screen, realizing she couldn't remember the last time she had made plans that weren't dictated by the royal calendar. Even her weekends were carefully orchestrated affairs, balanced between public duties and family time that often felt scheduled rather than spontaneous. She set the phone aside and opened the hospital letter. The director wrote about a new wing for pediatric cancer patients, expressing hope that the princess might consider a visit. Catherine made note to have her secretary arrange something, then paused. When had her life become so mediated, so filtered through assistants and protocols? She used to drive herself to engagements, arriving early to chat with staff members and volunteers. Now, every movement was choreographed, every conversation monitored. The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor made her look up. She recognized the measured pace of their private secretary, James, who would undoubtedly bring news of schedule adjustments or media concerns. The rhythm of royal life was relentless, each day packed with obligations that left little room for reflection or genuine connection. James knocked and entered with his usual professional smile. He carried a tablet and wore the expression of someone delivering news that wasn't entirely welcome. Catherine had learned to read these subtle signs over the years, the micro-expressions that palace staff used to communicate the complexity of their roles without ever speaking directly about the challenges they faced. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness," James said, approaching her desk with practiced deference. "I'm afraid there's been a development with this afternoon's engagement." Catherine gestured for him to continue, settling back in her chair. These developments had become increasingly common, she realized. Public events that needed to be adjusted, security concerns that changed itineraries, media attention that required additional preparation. Each modification was presented as necessary, professional, unavoidable. But each one also felt like another layer of separation from the world beyond palace walls. James explained that photographers had gathered outside the community center where she was scheduled to visit, far more than usual. The security team recommended additional protocols, which would mean a more formal arrival and shortened interaction time with the families she was meant to meet. Catherine nodded, understanding the logic while feeling disappointed by the implications. After James left, she remained at her desk, staring at the letter from the children's hospital. She thought about the last public engagement where she had felt truly connected to the people she met and realized it had been months ago. Not because she wasn't trying, but because the machinery of royal life seemed designed to create distance, even while facilitating connection. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had married into a family whose purpose was to serve the public, yet she often felt isolated from the very people they were meant to serve. The protocols that protected them also insulated them, creating a barrier that was both necessary and heartbreaking. Catherine rose from her desk and walked to another window, this one facing the private gardens where she and William sometimes walked in the evenings. She remembered a conversation they'd had just a few weeks ago, walking among the lavender bushes as twilight settled around them. William had mentioned feeling like he was living his life through bulletproof glass, present but separated from the world around him. She had understood exactly what he meant. Every public appearance was filtered through security assessments, media considerations, and protocol requirements. Every conversation with members of the public was brief, monitored, and carefully managed. The genuine moments of connection, when they did occur, felt precious precisely because they were so rare. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of children's laughter from somewhere in the distance. It took her a moment to realize it was coming from the staff quarters, where several employees lived with their families. The sound was spontaneous, unguarded, real in a way that made her chest tighten with longing. Catherine thought about her own children and the careful balance she and William tried to maintain between protecting their privacy and allowing them normal childhood experiences. Every outing required planning. Every play date involved security considerations. Every school event became a potential media story. She wondered if they would grow up feeling the same sense of separation she was experiencing, the same awareness of living life at one remove from genuine spontaneity. The princess returned to her desk and picked up a pen, then set it down again. She wanted to write something, but wasn't sure what. A letter to herself, perhaps, or to the woman she had been before this life, claimed her so completely. She wanted to remember what it felt like to make an impulsive decision, to have an unmonitored conversation, to feel completely present in a moment without considering how it might be perceived or reported. She thought about William, somewhere in the castle attending meetings that would determine their schedule for the coming weeks. Did he feel this same sense of distance? They talked about their duties, their children, their public responsibilities. But when had they last talked about their dreams, their fears, their hopes for a future that wasn't entirely dictated by duty? The clock on her desk chimed 11, reminding her that she had a wardrobe consultation in 30 minutes, followed by a briefing for this afternoon's modified engagement. The day would proceed according to plan, as royal days always did. She would smile, engage, represent the crown with dignity and grace. But something inside her longed for a moment of genuine connection, a conversation that wasn't scripted, a feeling that wasn't filtered through the complex machinery of royal life. Catherine stood and smoothed her dress, preparing to rejoin the carefully orchestrated rhythm of her day. But as she walked toward the door, she found herself hoping that somewhere in the hours ahead, she might find a moment of real human connection, however brief. A moment where the protocols fell away and she could simply be present with another person, sharing something true and unguarded. The hallway outside her study was quiet now, filled with the kind of expectant silence that seemed to characterize so much of palace life. Somewhere in this vast building, William was navigating his own version of this same careful dance between duty and authenticity. And somewhere beyond the walls, the world continued its messy, spontaneous, beautifully unpredictable existence, just beyond their reach. The community center buzzed with nervous energy as staff members made final preparations for the royal visit. Sarah Chun, the center's director, checked her watch for the third time in 5 minutes while volunteers positioned themselves at strategic points throughout the building. She had been running community programs for 15 years, but royal visits still made her stomach flutter with anticipation and anxiety. Outside, photographers lined the street despite the increased security presence. Word had somehow leaked about additional protocol measures, sparking speculation about the reason behind them. Social media buzzed with theories ranging from security threats to family tensions, each post generating dozens of comments and shares. The public appetite for royal news seemed insatiable, turning even routine engagements into subjects of intense scrutiny. Inside the palace, William finished his final meeting and glanced at his schedule. Catherine's engagement was highlighted in blue, marked as modified due to security considerations. He frowned, remembering a time when such modifications were rare exceptions rather than regular occurrences. The balance between public access and personal safety seemed to shift constantly, each incident or concern adding another layer of protection that also created another layer of separation. He thought about their conversation the previous evening, when Catherine had mentioned feeling disconnected from the people she was meant to serve. William understood the frustration intimately. His own recent engagements had felt increasingly choreographed, each interaction carefully managed to the point where genuine moments of connection became almost impossible to achieve. The prince left his office and walked through corridors lined with portraits of ancestors who had navigated their own versions of these same challenges. He wondered if they had felt this same tension between duty and authenticity, this same longing for unguarded human connection. The weight of centuries of tradition and expectation seemed to press against the possibility of spontaneous, genuine interaction. Meanwhile, at the community center, families began arriving for the programs they had been attending for weeks. Children raced through the halls toward their activity rooms while parents gathered in the cafe area, discussing everything from school enrollment to job searches. The atmosphere was warm and chaotic in the best possible way, filled with the kind of organic energy that made the center feel like a true community hub. Maria Rodriguez adjusted her son Diego's backpack and checked to make sure he had his inhaler. At 7 years old, Diego had been coming to the center's after-school program for 6 months, and the transformation in his confidence had been remarkable. Today felt special because important visitors were coming, though Diego wasn't entirely sure who they were or why everyone seemed so excited. Sarah gathered the staff for a final briefing, reminding them about the modified schedule and security requirements. The visit would be shorter than originally planned, with less flexibility for informal interactions. She tried to hide her disappointment while explaining the changes, knowing that some families had been looking forward to longer conversations about programs that had impacted their lives. The royal motorcade arrived precisely on schedule, a line of dark vehicles that seemed to darken the cheerful chaos of the community center's usual afternoon routine. Security personnel moved with practiced efficiency, creating a bubble of protection that also created a sense of separation from the very community the visit was meant to celebrate. Catherine stepped from a car, her smile warm and genuine despite the formal atmosphere. She had worn a simple blue dress, hoping to strike a balance between royal protocol and accessibility. But even her most casual choices were scrutinized and analyzed, photographed from every angle, and discussed in detail by fashion commentators and royal watchers. The princess was greeted by Sarah and the local mayor, a brief ceremony of handshakes and introductions that proceeded according to script. Catherine found herself following a predetermined path through the building, stopping at specific locations where carefully selected families waited to meet her. Each conversation was meaningful, but she was acutely aware of the time constraints and the presence of cameras documenting every word and gesture. In the children's art room, she met Diego, who was working on a painting of what he described as his dream house. It had a red door, yellow windows, and a garden full of flowers that reached the sky. Catherine knelt beside his easel, genuinely engaged by his imagination and the care he had put into every colorful detail. For a moment, the protocols and time pressures faded as she focused entirely on his enthusiastic explanation of each element in his painting. Diego asked if she liked to paint, and Catherine admitted that she hadn't painted in years. He offered to teach her, suggesting they could work on a picture together. The innocence of his offer, the genuine desire to share something he loved, touched something deep in Catherine's chest. She wanted nothing more than to sit down with him and spend an hour lost in the simple joy of creating something together. But the schedule moved them forward away from Diego's easel and toward the next programmed interaction. Catherine glanced back at him as security personnel gently guided the group along the designated route. He waved at her with paint-stained fingers, still excited about their brief conversation, unaware that their interaction had been cut short by considerations he couldn't possibly understand. The visit continued through the center's various programs, each stop carefully timed and managed. Catherine met teenage mothers learning parenting skills, elderly residents participating in intergenerational activities, and immigrants attending English language classes. Every person she encountered had a story, a reason for being at the center, a life that extended far beyond this brief moment of royal attention. She found herself wishing for more time with each person, more opportunity to understand their experiences and challenges. The modified schedule, while necessary for security reasons, felt like it was defeating the purpose of the visit. How could she truly understand the center's impact on the community if every interaction was rushed and monitored? In the cafe area, Catherine was introduced to Elena Vasquez, whose teenage daughter had struggled with depression until joining the center's peer support program. Elena spoke passionately about the transformation she had witnessed, her words tumbling over each other in her eagerness to share their story. But even as Catherine listened intently, she was aware of staff members checking their watches and security personnel monitoring the crowd that had gathered outside. The princess wanted to hear more about Elena's daughter's journey, to understand what specific aspects of the program had been most helpful. These details mattered enormously for her own advocacy work and for her understanding of effective community intervention. But the conversation was necessarily brief, limited by the constraints of the modified schedule and the awareness that every minute of delay had ripple effects throughout the carefully planned day. As the visit neared its end, Catherine participated in a traditional closing ceremony where children from various programs presented her with artwork and letters. Standing before the assembled group, she felt the weight of their expectations and the limitation of what this brief visit could actually accomplish. She wanted to promise ongoing support, to assure them that their stories mattered beyond this single afternoon, but the formal nature of the setting made such personal commitments feel inappropriate. During the final handshakes and thank yous, Sarah whispered that the center would love to host her again whenever possible. Catherine nodded, meaning it sincerely while knowing that future visits would likely face the same constraints and limitations. The machinery of royal scheduling and security requirements seemed to work against the very connections these engagements were meant to foster. As Catherine walked back toward the waiting motorcade, she caught sight of Diego through a window, still working on his painting. He had added a figure to his dream house picture, a woman in a blue dress standing in the garden among the sky-high flowers. The gesture was so simple and sweet that it made her throat tighten with emotion. The motorcade pulled away from the community center, leaving behind the genuine warmth and energy of the place. Catherine sat in the back seat, processing the afternoon's interactions while crowds of photographers captured images of her departure. She thought about Diego's offer to teach her to paint, Elena's passion for her daughter's recovery, and all the conversations that had been cut short by the requirements of royal protocol. The visit had been successful by official standards. She had met community members, highlighted important programs, and generated positive media coverage for the center's work. But Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that something essential had been lost in the careful management of every moment. The genuine connections she craved seemed to exist just beyond reach, glimpsed briefly before being moved along by the relentless requirements of royal duty. Evening descended over Windsor Castle like a familiar blanket, bringing with it the quiet that only came after the daily machinery of royal life had wound down. Catherine had returned from her engagement hours earlier, but the feeling of disconnection lingered as she moved through the private apartments that had become both sanctuary and gilded cage. William found her in their sitting room, curled in the corner of their sofa with a cup of tea growing cold on the side table. She was staring at nothing in particular, lost in thoughts that seemed to weigh heavily on her shoulders. He had seen this expression more frequently lately, a kind of distant sadness that appeared after public engagements and lingered well into the evening hours. He settled beside her without speaking, understanding instinctively that she needed space to process whatever had happened during her afternoon at the community center. They had learned over the years to read each other's moods and needs, developing a silent communication that helped them navigate the unique pressures of their shared life. Catherine eventually turned toward him, her eyes reflecting the kind of exhaustion that came not from physical activity, but from emotional constraint. She told him about Diego and his painting, about Elena's passionate advocacy for her daughter, about all the conversations that had felt rushed and incomplete. Her voice carried a note of frustration that had been building for months, maybe longer. William listened without interrupting, recognizing his own experiences in her description of the day. He thought about his recent visit to a veterans facility, where he had been moved by the stories he heard, but frustrated by the limited time he had to really connect with the men and women he met. The parallel experiences of isolation within connection had become a recurring theme in their private conversations. They talked quietly about the increasing layers of protocol that seemed to surround every public appearance. Security concerns that once applied only to high-risk situations now seemed standard for even routine engagements. The careful management of every interaction, while understandable from a safety perspective, was creating an almost insurmountable barrier to the genuine human connection that had originally motivated their public service. Catherine mentioned her conversation with Diego again, focusing on the moment when he had offered to teach her paint. The innocence and generosity of the gesture had stayed with her throughout the afternoon, representing something pure and uncomplicated that felt increasingly rare in her daily life. She wondered aloud when she had last engaged in an activity simply for the joy of it, without consideration of how it might be perceived or reported. William understood the longing in her voice because he felt it too. Their lives had become so structured, so mediated by considerations beyond their control, that spontaneous joy had become almost impossible to achieve. Even their private moments together were shadowed by awareness of upcoming obligations and public expectations. The prince described his own recent experience at a school opening, where he had been charmed by a group of children who insisted on showing him their science project. They had been working on a model of the solar system, each planet carefully painted and positioned according to their understanding of cosmic distances. Their enthusiasm had been infectious, their pride in their work genuinely moving. But the interaction had been brief, managed by teachers and officials who were mindful of schedule constraints and media attention. Catherine nodded, recognizing the pattern. These moments of genuine connection occurred despite the constraints of royal protocol, not because of them. She and William were surrounded by people whose job it was to facilitate their public engagements, yet those same support systems often seemed to work against the authentic interactions they most valued. They discussed the paradox of their situation with the kind of honesty that was only possible in these private evening conversations. Their public role was to represent the monarchy's connection to the people, yet they often felt more isolated from genuine human experience than ever before. The machinery designed to support their work sometimes seemed to defeat its own purpose. Catherine stood and walked to the window, looking out over gardens that were beautiful, but somehow felt more like a painting than a real place. She mentioned feeling like she was living her life behind glass, visible but not quite reachable. The metaphor resonated with William, who had used similar language to describe his own sense of separation from the world beyond palace walls. The princess talked about wanting to return to the community center, not for an official visit, but simply to spend time with people like Diego and Elena. She wanted to sit with Diego and actually learn to paint, to hear the complete story of Elena's daughter's recovery, to engage with the community as a person rather than as a representative of an institution. But even as she voiced these desires, both she and William understood the impossibility of such informal contact. Every public appearance required security coordination, media management, and official protocols. The idea of simply showing up somewhere as private individuals was a luxury they had forfeited along with many others when they accepted their roles. William joined her at the window, and they stood together looking out at the darkening landscape. The silence between them was comfortable but tinged with a shared sense of loss for experiences they couldn't have and connections they couldn't make. The weight of duty, which they had accepted willingly and with full understanding of its implications, sometimes felt heavier than they had anticipated. Catherine leaned against William's shoulder, finding comfort in the one relationship that remained unmediated by protocol and public consideration. Their marriage had become a refuge from the performed aspects of their public life, a place where they could be completely honest about the costs and challenges of their service. They talked about their children and their hope that George, Charlotte, and Louis might find ways to maintain authentic connections despite the constraints they would inevitably face. Both parents were determined to provide their children with as much normal experience as possible, while knowing that normal would always be relative for members of the royal family. The conversation eventually turned to the future and their hope that evolving attitudes about royal accessibility might create new opportunities for genuine public engagement. They discussed potential changes to protocol that might allow for more spontaneous interaction while maintaining necessary security measures. But both recognized that such changes would be gradual and might not address the fundamental tension between public service and personal authenticity. As the evening progressed, Catherine and William found themselves talking less and simply being present with each other. The comfortable silence of a couple who had learned to find peace within the constraints of their shared circumstances. They had accepted that their public life would always involve some degree of performance and limitation, but they had also created private spaces where they could be completely themselves. The clock in their sitting room chimed 10, reminding them that tomorrow would bring another full schedule of engagements and obligations. Catherine thought about Diego's painting and wondered if he had finished adding details to his dream house. She thought about Elena and hoped the center would continue to provide the support her family needed. These thoughts weren't accompanied by the earlier frustration, but rather by a quiet determination to find ways to make their public service more meaningful despite its constraints. Perhaps genuine connection couldn't always be achieved within the formal structure of royal engagements, but it could be honored and valued even in brief moments. William squeezed Catherine's hand, a small gesture that carried years of shared understanding and mutual support. They were partners in this complex dance between public duty and private longing, allies in finding meaning within limitation. Their love had become both sanctuary and strength, the foundation that made everything else possible. The princess realized that while she couldn't paint with Diego or have lengthy conversations with Elena, she could carry their stories with her and find ways to honor their experiences in her broader advocacy work. The individual connections might be brief, but their cumulative impact could be lasting and meaningful. As they prepared to end their evening, Catherine felt a shift in her perspective. The constraints of royal life were real and sometimes painful, but they didn't negate the value of the work she and William were doing. Perhaps the challenge was learning to find fulfillment within limitation, connection within constraint, authenticity within the necessary performance of public service. Tomorrow would bring new engagements and new opportunities to serve, each one carrying the potential for moments of genuine human connection, however brief. The glass barrier between them and the world might never fully disappear, but perhaps they could learn to reach through it more effectively, to honor the people they met and the stories they shared. Catherine settled back against William's shoulder, feeling grateful for this quiet space where they could process the complexities of their shared mission. In the morning, they would return to their public roles with renewed commitment to finding meaning within constraint, connection within protection, and authenticity within the carefully choreographed dance of royal service. 3 weeks had passed since Catherine's visit to the community center, but Diego's painting remained vivid in her memory. The image of his dream house with its sky-high flowers and the small figure in a blue dress had taken root in her imagination, becoming a symbol of something she couldn't quite name, but deeply felt. She found herself thinking about it at unexpected moments, during formal dinners, and official meetings, as if her mind was trying to hold on to something authentic in a world that often felt carefully constructed. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the drawing room, where Catherine and William were reviewing their schedules for the coming week. The familiar routine of planning and preparation surrounded them, but something in the air felt different. Perhaps it was the way Catherine paused longer than usual over certain engagements, or how William asked more detailed questions about the communities they would be visiting. Catherine had been corresponding privately with Sarah from the community center, learning more about the programs and the families they served. These letters, written in her personal time and outside the formal channels of royal communication, had become a source of genuine connection for her. Through Sarah's updates, she learned that Diego had continued working on paintings of houses, each one more elaborate and colorful than the last. Elena's daughter had started mentoring other teenagers in the peer support program, transforming her own recovery into service to others. The princess shared these updates with William during their morning coffee, a ritual that had become increasingly precious to both of them. These quiet conversations before the official day began were perhaps the only time they could speak freely about their hopes and frustrations without considering how their words might be interpreted or reported. William mentioned his own recent correspondence with a veteran he had met during a hospital visit. The man had been recovering from surgery and had spoken passionately about his desire to start a program helping other veterans transition to civilian careers. William had been moved by his determination and had quietly connected him with resources that might help make his dream a reality. These behind-the-scenes connections, invisible to the public and the media, had become increasingly important to both royals. The conversation was interrupted by James, their private secretary, who brought news of a scheduling conflict that would require them to choose between two important engagements. As he outlined the pros and cons of each option, Catherine found herself thinking not about protocol or media coverage, but about which event would allow for more meaningful interaction with the people involved. After James left, Catherine and William discussed the decision with a focus on impact rather than optics. They had begun approaching their public schedule differently in recent weeks, asking more questions about the communities they visited and pushing gently for modifications that might allow for deeper engagement. Some changes were possible. Others ran up against security concerns or time constraints that couldn't be adjusted. The phone on William's desk rang, and he answered to find a call from the community center. Sarah was calling to share surprising news. Diego had asked if he could send another painting to the princess. He had been working on it since her visit, she explained, and it was different from his usual house paintings. This one showed two people sitting together at an easel, painting flowers that seemed to dance off the canvas. Catherine's breath caught when William relayed the message. The gesture was so simple and yet so profound, a 7-year-old's understanding that connection could transcend the constraints of formal visits and official protocols. She asked William to tell Sarah that she would be honored to receive Diego's painting, and that she hoped to see his continued artistic development. After hanging up, William noticed tears in Catherine's eyes. She wasn't sad, she explained, but moved by the reminder that their work did matter to real people, even when the impact wasn't immediately visible. Diego's painting represented hope and imagination, qualities that she wanted to protect and nurture despite the limitations of their formal roles. The royal couple decided to make an unannounced visit to their children's playroom, where George, Charlotte, and Louis were engaged in their own creative projects. Charlotte was working on a story about a princess who lived in a tower made of books, while George built elaborate structures with blocks, and Louis created abstract sculptures from modeling clay. Watching their children's uninhibited creativity reminded Catherine and William of what they were working to protect and preserve. Catherine sat with Charlotte and listened to her story, marveling at her daughter's imagination and the fearless way she combined elements from different fairy tales to create something entirely new. William joined George on the floor, helping to construct a castle that seemed to defy several laws of physics, but embodied pure joy in its construction. These moments with their children felt like gifts, reminders of what spontaneous creativity looked like, and what authentic connection felt like. Catherine realized that while she might not be able to paint with Diego or have unlimited time with Elena, she could ensure that her own children grew up understanding the value of genuine human connection and creative expression. Later that day, Catherine was reviewing briefing materials for an upcoming engagement when she made an unusual request. She asked James to arrange for her to arrive 30 minutes early at the children's hospital she would be visiting, not for additional protocol or media opportunities, but to spend unscheduled time with patients and staff. The request was met with some resistance from security and scheduling teams, but Catherine persisted, explaining that these informal moments were becoming essential to her ability to serve effectively. The compromise reached allowed for 20 extra minutes, carefully managed but less structured than her usual hospital visits. Catherine felt a small victory in this negotiation, proof that changes were possible when she advocated clearly for what she needed to do her job well. William observed his wife's increased advocacy for meaningful engagement with admiration and recognition. He began making similar requests for his own engagements, pushing for longer conversations and less structured time with the people he met. The palace staff initially struggled with these modifications to establish protocol, but gradually began to understand that the royals' effectiveness depended partly on their ability to form genuine connections. The evening before Catherine's hospital visit, she and William sat in their private garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades that reminded Catherine of Diego's flower paintings. They talked about the gradual changes they were implementing in their approach to public service, small modifications that might allow for more authentic engagement without compromising security or protocol. William mentioned receiving a letter from the veteran he had been corresponding with, reporting progress on his transition program, and expressing gratitude for the quiet support he had received. Catherine shared an update from Elena, whose daughter had been accepted into university and was planning to study social work. These ongoing connections, maintained through personal correspondence rather than official channels, had become a source of deep satisfaction for both royals. As darkness settled around them, Catherine reflected on the evolution of her understanding of her role. She had initially focused on representing the monarchy with dignity and grace, fulfilling duties assigned to her with professional competence. But over time, she had learned that her most meaningful contributions came through genuine human connection, even when those connections were brief or constrained by protocol. The princess thought about Diego's upcoming painting and what it might teach her about seeing their work through the eyes of those they served. Children, she realized, had an ability to find joy and meaning in situations that adults might view as limited or frustrating. Perhaps there was wisdom in Diego's perspective, in his ability to transform a brief meeting into an ongoing creative relationship. William reached for Catherine's hand as they sat in the gathering darkness, both of them processing the day's conversations and planning for tomorrow's challenges. They had learned that their private partnership was essential to their public service, that the support they provided each other enabled them to give more to the people and causes they served. The palace around them was settling into its nighttime quiet, but Catherine felt more awake and purposeful than she had in months. The changes they were making were small and gradual, but they were meaningful. Each successful modification to protocol, each extra moment of connection with community members, each letter exchanged outside official channels represented progress toward more authentic public service. Catherine thought about tomorrow's hospital visit and the 20 extra minutes she had negotiated for unstructured interaction. She planned to use that time not for additional photo opportunities or formal presentations, but for listening to stories that might not make it into the official visit summary, but would inform her understanding of the challenges facing young patients and their families. As they prepared to go inside, Catherine felt a quiet sense of anticipation rather than the dread that had been accompanying her public engagements in recent months. She was learning to work within constraints rather than being defeated by them, to find meaning in brief connections rather than mourning the longer relationships she couldn't have. The princess realized that Diego's painting had become a metaphor for their entire approach to public service, like his artistic vision of two people sharing creative space. Her work with William was about finding ways to connect authentically despite the barriers that surrounded them. They couldn't eliminate the glass that separated them from the world, but they could learn to reach through it more effectively, to honor the people they met and the trust placed in them. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to serve, new chances to find moments of genuine connection within the structured requirements of royal duty. Catherine felt ready to embrace both the possibilities and the limitations, understanding finally that meaningful service was possible even within constraint, that authentic connection could flourish even in brief encounters, and that the work of building bridges between the monarchy and the people was both privilege and responsibility she would continue to honor with everything she had.